Imagine a Chinese emperor with over 100 sons, yet when he died in 1521, there was no heir to take the throne. Into this crisis stepped a 14-year-old boy who would fight court officials to claim his crown, then turn and fight Portuguese warships to defend his empire. He won both battles, but at the very moment China could have joined the global tide, he chose to shut the door. China's Ming dynasty was no stranger to eccentric rulers, but even in that colorful lineup, none rivaled the excesses of Hu Chong, the Zhengde emperor. The Forbidden City, meant to be the solemn heart of an empire, was turned by Zhengde into a personal playground. His notorious Leopard House was filled with exotic animals and beautiful courtesans, while elsewhere in the palace, Tibetan shrines hosted his self-styled Lama performances. He even built a fake street market where ministers were forced to dress as merchants and haggle for imaginary goods, all to amuse their emperor in his elaborate role plays. To preserve the illusion of imperial continuity, he ceremonially adopted over 100 boys, the sons of favored officials and palace staff, yet fathered none himself. The elaborate fiction couldn't hide one truth: the empire had no real heir. Now, with his sudden death, the empire faced not just a political vacuum, but a deeper crisis of legitimacy. In the midst of chaos, Grand Secretary Yang led a frantic search through the imperial genealogy and found a candidate, Hu Chong, a 14-year-old prince from Hubei province. The boy was quiet, studious, and unknown to the capital elite. He was also the last surviving male descendant of the previous emperor's bloodline. But his claim came with complications. By Confucian protocol, as the biological son of a regional prince, he would have to be posthumously adopted into the imperial succession line to qualify for the throne. Officials arranged for him to enter the Forbidden City through the Donghua Gate, a passage reserved for imperial nephews, not reigning emperors. The implication was clear: he was to inherit the throne by adoption, not by blood. Hu Chong halted his carriage just outside the Donghua Gate and refused to proceed. "The edict names me emperor," he declared, "not adopted son." This wasn't a tantrum. It was a calculated move. Trained rigorously by his father, Hu Chong understood that in Confucian cosmology, ritual was power. To rule as emperor, he had to defend his lineage. Quoting the rights of Zhou, he argued, "If a ruler cannot honor his own parents, how can he govern the realm?" For 3 tense days, he camped outside the gate, refusing to yield. The imperial court was paralyzed. Senior officials found themselves locked in a public standoff with a teenage prince who would not bend. At last, the bureaucrats relented. The boy entered the palace through the Meridian Gate, the front gate used only by emperors. And that's exactly what he did, head held high. In that moment, the teenage emperor outmaneuvered the most powerful faction at court. But it was only the beginning. Within months, that standoff would escalate into a full-blown political firestorm, later known as the Great Rights Controversy. While scholars in Beijing debated the ethics of succession, a very different challenge was emerging on China's southern coast. This one armed with cannons. Since 1517, Portuguese envoys and traders had been arriving by sea. Initially, the Portuguese were welcomed by the Zhengde emperor, who saw these strange foreign visitors as little more than another exotic curiosity, no more threatening than the leopards in his palace entertainments. But their conduct soon turned amusement into alarm. Led by Fernão Pires, the Portuguese built unauthorized fortresses in what is now Tonmen, in Hong Kong's new territories. They mounted cannons, erected gallows to execute locals, and kidnapped villagers for the slave trade. To the Ming court, this wasn't diplomacy, it was piracy. Unlike his predecessor, the newly enthroned Jiajing emperor took a very different approach. In the very first year of his reign, he ordered a swift and uncompromising military response. Thus began the Battle of Tonmen in the summer of 1521, the first recorded naval battle between China and a European power. The Portuguese carracks were monstrous ships, built for transoceanic war. Their hulls were triple the thickness of Chinese junks, and their cannons could hurl stone balls heavier than a man across vast distances. The first Ming assault was disastrous. Portuguese records claim that 20 Chinese ships were sunk in a single morning. But China adapted. General Wang Hong, tasked with leading the counterattack, abandoned direct naval assault. Instead, he turned to local fishermen and pirates, men who knew every reef and current of the Pearl River Delta. He disguised fireboats as merchant ships and coordinated shore-based artillery to trap the European fleet. On September 27th, when favorable winds arrived, Chinese fireboats rammed the Portuguese flagship and set it ablaze. Within days, the remaining European forces fled, abandoning their scorched fortress and broken fleet. It was a remarkable tactical victory. China had, against the odds, repelled a modern Western navy. Yet the triumph came at a cost. Thousands of Ming sailors died in the campaign. More importantly, the empire failed to learn from the encounter. Captured Portuguese weaponry, including breech-loading cannons, were dismissed as curiosities. Barbarian tricks, said the officials. Some were reverse-engineered into the so-called Folungji guns, but there was no broader naval modernization. The deeper significance of the battle was ignored. Rather than embracing the new maritime reality, the Ming court took Tonmen as a warning and shut the door on the world that was just beginning to arrive. Back in Beijing, the victory at Tonmen only strengthened Jiajing's confidence in his rule. But instead of reflecting on China's first clash with the West, the young emperor turned inward, toward a different kind of war. His focus shifted to a bitter domestic struggle over ritual and legitimacy. Jiajing insisted on honoring his biological father, a regional prince with full imperial status. But Confucian tradition required him to be adopted into the previous emperor's line and worship a different ancestral lineage. This was more than symbolism. In Confucian political order, ritual meant power, and whoever controlled the rites controlled the throne's moral foundation. What began as a ceremonial disagreement later came to be known by historians as the Great Rites Controversy, a furious struggle over bloodlines, ritual, and imperial legitimacy. For 3 years, court officials resisted, citing centuries of dynastic precedent. Jiajing held his ground. He suspended ministers, purged opponents, and ruled through fear. By 1524, the boy who once halted his carriage outside the palace gates had bent an empire to his will, and silenced those who dared to oppose him. His father, a provincial prince never meant to be part of the imperial line, was posthumously honored as Emperor Xingqian. And Jiajing had imposed his authority, not just over the court, but over the ideological foundations of the dynasty. Looking back, 1521 was more than a year of succession and skirmish. It was a crossroads. A teenage emperor had chosen personal loyalty over institutional compromise. A military victory had produced complacency instead of curiosity. And a nation had turned inward, just as the outside world accelerated toward globalization. In Europe, Martin Luther was redefining Christianity. The Reformation was breaking old certainties apart. Portuguese fleets, despite their defeat at Tonmen, continued to circle the globe, learning, trading, and transforming. Meanwhile, the Ming dynasty stood still. What if China had embraced the technology it captured at Tonmen? What if it had engaged, not rejected, this new, connected world? These are the questions history leaves behind. And their answers may lie not just in the ashes of burnt Portuguese ships, or in the silent halls of the Forbidden City, but in the echoes of a year when an empire stood at a crossroads and chose isolation.